Charles Manson convinced his followers to begin a murder spree in LA and make the crimes look racially motivated. Gary Hinman was held hostage by 3 Manson family members for 2 days. He was eventually stabbed to death, and they used his blood to write "Political Piggy" on the wall, along with the Black Panther symbol. On the night of August 8, 1969, 4 family members went to the home of director Roman Polanski and actress Sharon Tate and killed Tate and 5 friends who were in the home. Sharon Tate was pregnant at the time and pled for the mercy of her unborn child, only to be brutally stabbed. Jay Sebring tried to stop this and was also shot and stabbed. Wojciech Farkowski and Abigail Folger managed to escape the home, but they were caught in the lawn and stabbed a combined total of 80 times. They also wrote "pig" on the door in Sharon Tate's blood. The next night, Manson took them to the La Bianca residence. Leno and Rosemary were tied up with pillowcases placed over their heads. They were both stabbed to death in the same frenzied fashion, and Leno had "war" carved into his abdomen. "Rise, Death the Pigs," and "Helter Skelter" were written in blood. We'll talk about the capture and sentencing in part. Alright, this one's going to be controversial, but let's talk about the Eazy-E death conspiracy theory. Although Eazy-E died from AIDS in March 1995, theorists believe that Suge Knight had something to do with his death. Some of the reasons are that none of the mothers of his children had AIDS. He had a full physical with a clean bill in July of '94, and in 1991, Suge Knight and 2 others confronted Eazy with baseball bats and forced him to release Dr. Dre so they could sign them with their record label. Eazy-E's son also questions this theory. He posts this on Instagram. Pause to read the caption. I'll add the clip in at the end of this video. These factors, paired with how quickly Eazy's health declined, led to the theory that Suge injected Eazy with a dirty needle. It's been debated among fans and medical professionals. What do you guys think? Here's Suge's appearance on Jimmy Kimmel.
They get blood from somebody with AIDS, and then they shoot you with it.
Oh,
so
that seems bad.
That's a slow death. The easy thing, you know what I mean?
Oh, no.
In this house on November 13th, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered his entire family, one by one, while they were sleeping with a rifle. Ronald confessed and was sentenced to 25 life sentences. About a year later, the Lutz family moved into the house and moved out after only 28 days. George Lutz said he would wake up around 3 a.m. every morning, and that's around the time that Ronald murdered his family. He also reported seeing his family levitating from their beds. They experienced cold spots and strange odors. They had a priest come and cleanse the house, and he claims to have heard somebody yell, "Get out." Some of you may recognize this house from the movie The Amityville Horror. The house still stands in Long Island, New York, and I'm hoping to plan a trip there eventually. Would you go? Charles Manson is a name that'll probably ring a bell to most of my followers. The notorious killer who may have never actually killed anyone himself. He was born in 1934 to a 16-year-old sex worker named Kathleen. She had a drinking problem and would often leave him alone. He never knew his biological father, but he's believed to be a con artist named Colonel Walker Henderson Scott Jr. Charles started rebelling at a young age with things such as petty theft and fire starting. He was known to have violent and manipulative tendencies. It said he would manipulate classmates into beating up kids he didn't like. He was in and out of foster homes, and at the age of 13, he was sent to a boys' Catholic school for delinquents. The school was known for abuse, and eventually he ran away. He lived on the streets and eventually made it to Indianapolis. There, he began robbing grocery stores and stealing. Over the following years, he was in and out of prisons and institutions. In 1967, he was released from prison, and this is when the formation of the family began. We'll talk about the formation of this cult in part 2. Iconic Horror Day 2. Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th originally came out in 1980, written by Victor Miller and produced and directed by Sean S. Cunningham. It was the highest grossing horror franchise in the world until Halloween came out in 2018, and it was originally supposed to be called Long Night at Camp Blood. In this first installment of the franchise, we find out that Jason Voorhees died at Camp Crystal Lake in 1957, and the next year 2 camp counselors were murdered. In 1980, the camp is reopened even though they're warned not to. Soon after, people there begin getting killed. Of course, most of us know the twist in this first film, but if you don't, go watch it. From then on, Jason, with his famous hockey mask, has been slashing in the franchise's 12 films. Iconic horror films, Day 1. Starting off strong with Scream. Scream originally came out in 1996 and was directed by Wes Craven. Also in the opening scene, it's actually Wes Craven in the Ghostface costume. He also makes a brief cameo as a janitor. Reinvented the classic horror with a modern twist. Mixed in a little dark comedy and played with the cliches of horror movies. The basic plot is a masked maniac, aka Ghostface, stalking and killing high school students. There have been 4 films in the franchise to date and even a TV series. And there's a 5th film coming out in 2022. David Arquette, Courtney Cox, and Neve Campbell will be returning, so I'm really excited about that. Let me know what you guys think about the 5th one coming out. Disturbing Serial Killer Quotes, Part 20. Charles Manson. I've killed no one. I've ordered no one to be killed. These children who come to you with their knives, they're your children. I didn't teach them. You did. Okay, so Charles Manson wasn't really a serial killer, but he did start a cult that killed people. Alright, this one's going to be controversial, but let's talk about the Eazy-E death conspiracy theory. Although Eazy-E died from AIDS in March 1995, theorists believe that Suge Knight had something to do with his death. Some of the reasons are that none of the mothers of his children had AIDS. He had a full physical with a clean bill in July of 94. And in 1991, Suge Knight and 2 others confronted Eazy with baseball bats and forced him to release Dr. Dre so they could sign them with their record label. Eazy-E's son also questions this theory. He posts this on Instagram. Pause to read the caption. I'll add the clip in at the end of this video. These factors, paired with how quickly Eazy's health declined, led to the theory that Suge injected Eazy with a dirty needle. It's been debated among fans and medical professionals. What do you guys think? Here's Suge's appearance on Jimmy Kimmel.
They get blood from somebody with AIDS, and then they shoot you with it.
Oh, so that seems bad.
That's a slow death.
Yeah.
An easy thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, no.
In Washington, D.C. from 1971 to 1972, 6 women were murdered by a killer known as the Freeway Phantom. They were all women of color ranging from 10 to 18. They were snatched off the streets of D.C., strangled, and discarded by busy roads. 3 of the girls had been sexually assaulted. 5 of the 6 girls were found fully dressed but with their shoes missing. 4 out of the 6 had the middle name Denise. They were Carol Spanks, Darlenia Johnson, Brenda Crockett, Nina Washia Yates, Brenda Woodward, and Diane Williams. A note was found in Brenda's pants pocket saying, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will omit the others when you catch me if you can. Freeway Phantom." They were able to conclude that this was written by Brenda, but that the killer had been telling her what to write. There were several suspects, but never enough evidence for a conviction. In 1990, an investigator wanted the evidence to be DNA tested, but law enforcement had done a poor job of preserving it, so it couldn't be done. Because of that, these girls may never have justice. Disturbing Serial Killer Quotes, Part 17. Richard Ramirez. We've all got the power in our hands to kill, but most people are afraid to use it. The ones who aren't afraid control life itself. Richard Ramirez killed 14 people in less than a year. Disturbing Serial Killer Quotes, Part 22. Jeffrey Dahmer. My consuming lust was to experience their bodies. I viewed them as objects, as strangers. It is hard for me to believe a human being could have done what I've done. In that quote, Dahmer is talking about his cannibalism. This is Abby Williams and Libby German. They were 13 and 14 when they were found murdered, and the case is still unsolved. In February 2017, their bodies were found about a half a mile off a trail where they had been hiking in Delphi, Indiana. What's unique about this case is the girls were posting on Snapchat the day they were killed. Police released this photo of a man walking in the background who is yet to be identified. And a few days later, they revealed that there was actually audio taken from Libby's phone. Over a year later, they released more audio footage and a new sketch. There have been several suspects, but they're still asking for the public's help in this. Here are the recordings. The Exorcism of Emily Rose was based on the story of Anneliese Michel. Anneliese grew up devoutly Catholic in West Germany. At the age of 16, she began having blackouts, going into trance-like states and convulsions. She was diagnosed as epileptic, given medication, and started attending university. But her symptoms only escalated. She saw the face of a demon everywhere and heard demons whispering in her ears. Believing she was possessed by a demon, she began ripping off her clothes, eating spiders and coal, biting the heads off birds. She eventually found a priest who agreed to do an exorcism. Over the next 10 months, they did 67 exorcisms. During this time, Anneliese said she was possessed by 6 demons: Lucifer, Cain, Judas, Adolf Hitler, Nero, and Fleischmann. She broke bones and ripped tendons in her knees from constantly kneeling in prayer, and eventually died of malnutrition and dehydration in July 1976 at only 23. Disturbing Serial Killer Quotes, Part 18. The Zodiac Killer. I like killing people because it's so much fun. It's more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of them all. The Zodiac Killer was never caught, but he did communicate with the police through letters. Disturbing Serial Killer Quotes, Part 21. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. I also picked prostitutes as victims because they were easy to pick up without being noticed. I knew they would not be reported missing right away and might never be reported missing. He was convicted of 49 murders and confessed to 71. This is your weekly true crime wrap-up, and it's been a pretty exciting week for true crime. On Thursday, the victims and families of the Golden State Killer were able to speak their piece in their victim statements. Joseph DeAngelo showed no emotion throughout these statements. But I'm happy the victims and their families finally have some sort of closure. And on Friday, Joseph DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. I'm sure many of you follow Sarah Turney on TikTok and see her tireless fight for justice for her sister Alyssa Turney. Well, this week, her father and Alyssa's stepfather, Michael Turney, was charged with the murder of Alyssa Turney. I'm so happy for Sarah to see her hard work pay off, and soon, hopefully, she'll have justice for Alyssa.
I've listened all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to every one of her. Thank you, Your Honor.
In 1972, John Washwitz unsuccessfully tried to rob a bank to pay for his wife Eden's gender reassignment surgery. He used the film The Godfather as an inspiration for his plan. He was arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison, but only served 5. In 1975, his story was turned into a film called Dog Day Afternoon, starring Al Pacino, who was also in The Godfather. John was paid $7,500 plus 1% of the film's profits, which he gave to Eden for her surgery. Following her surgery, Eden ended up marrying someone else and eventually dying of AIDS-related pneumonia in 1987, and John attended her funeral and delivered a eulogy. Unsolved serial killers, the Cleveland Torso murderer. Between 1934 and 1938, a serial killer murdered and dismembered at least 12 victims, and only 2 were identified. Most were decapitated while they were still alive. In September 1934, the lower half of a woman's torso was found on the shore of Lake Erie. It was covered in a preservative and the head was never found. Next, a decapitated corpse was found near Kingsbury Run. The body was clean and drained of blood with rope burns around the wrists. Police discovered a second body nearby, decapitated and covered in the same preservative. Next up was a half of a female, neatly wrapped, and the head was never found. For the next few years, bodies would continue to turn up in the same condition. The last known victims were found August 1938. The torso of a woman wrapped in clothing, with her legs, arms, and head discovered in a box wrapped in brown butcher paper. Agent Elliot Ness had a suspect who he believed to be the killer and who taunted him for many years after the killing stopped. Disturbing serial killer quotes, part 19. Ted Bundy. We serial killers are your sons. We are your husbands. We are everywhere, and there will be more of your children dead tomorrow. I think most of us know what Ted Bundy did, but if you don't, let me know in the comments. This is Alexander Kanua, who was charged with murdering and eating his roommate. Fun fact, Alexander was actually in my graduating class in high school. His 37-year-old roommate, Cujo, went missing on May 25, 2012. They both attended Morgan State University and were living in the basement of Alexander's family home. A few days later, Alexander's brother found tins containing what seemed to be human remains. After searching the house, police also found the head and hands of Cujo. The rest of the remains were found in a dumpster in a church down the street. While being interviewed, Alexander admitted that he killed Cujo, cut him up with a knife, and ate his heart and parts of his brain. According to fellow students, his mental state seemed to be deteriorating in previous months. He even had a previous charge of hitting a student with a baseball bat while saying, "Somebody's got to protect the kids." He also had been posting about human sacrifice on his Facebook. He was committed to Maryland's maximum security psychiatric hospital. Have you ever woken up on a Monday in a terrible mood? Well, I bet it couldn't be as bad as Brenda Spencer's. On January 29, 1979 at 8:30 a.m., Brenda fired a rifle from her bedroom window. She aimed it at the children waiting to enter the elementary school across the street from her. She shot 8 children, killing a school principal and a janitor in the process. When asked why she did this, she said, "I don't like Mondays." She is currently alive and in prison serving a 25 to life sentence. This mask is made out of human skin. It was made by serial killer Ed Gein and inspired Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He also used human skin to upholster chairs, a lampshade, and a trash can. And he made a belt and corset out of human nipples. He also used skulls to make bowls. He missed his calling for interior design. Bonnie Heim went missing in Jacksonville, Florida in 1993. When detectives were investigating the case, her 3-year-old son Aaron said, "Daddy hurt Mommy and Daddy put Mommy in timeout." But without a body or much evidence, it was hard to build a case against Michael Heim. 20 years later, Aaron was doing renovations on his childhood home when human remains were found under a slab of concrete. DNA tests confirmed that these remains were his mother's, and shell casings found with the remains matched a gun that his father owned. Michael Heim was arrested in 2015. He was said to have been abusive towards Bonnie and found out that she had a secret bank account and was planning to leave him. In 2019, Michael was sentenced to life in prison. Disturbing Serial Killer Quotes, Part 16. Eileen Wuornos. I robbed them, and I killed them as cold as ice, and I would do it again. And I know I would kill another person because I've hated humans for a long time. Eileen murdered 7 men when working as a sex worker. Disturbing Serial Killer Quotes, Part 15. Ed Kemper. The head trip fantasies were a bit like a trophy. You know, the head is where everything is at. The brain, eyes, mouth, that's the person. I remember being told as a kid, you cut off the head and the body dies. The body is nothing after the head is cut off. Well, that's not quite true. There's a lot left in a girl's body without the head. As you can tell, Ed Kemper had a thing for cutting off people's heads. Killer's Last Words, Part 9. Clarence Ray Allen wrote his last words. He said, "My last words will be, Hoka hey, it's a good day to die. Thank you very much. I love you all. Goodbye." Allen murdered Mary Sue Kitts in 1974. He also organized the murders of 3 others who were attempting to act as witnesses during his trial. Killer's Last Words, Part 10. Patrick Brian Knight. I said I was going to tell a joke. Death has set me free. That's the biggest joke. I deserve this. The other joke is that I am not Patrick Brian Knight, and y'all can't stop this execution now. Go ahead, I'm finished. Knight was found guilty of killing his 2 neighbors, Walter and Mary Ann Werner, in 1991. He was executed by lethal injection in 2007. Despite the similarities, the Tate and LaBianca murders weren't initially connected. Around this time, the Manson family ranch was raided and members were charged on separate charges, including vandalism and theft. Family member Susan Atkins was also booked for the murder of Gary Hinman. While questioning witnesses, there was suggestion that Manson could be connected to the Tate murders. Atkins also began confessing to bunkmates while in jail. Once the puzzle pieces were connected, the trial for Manson and his family began in June 1970. Throughout the trial, they showed no remorse for their crimes, often giggling or even singing. In this photo, you see 3 female members with X's carved into their foreheads, mimicking Manson, who had done the same. Manson and the 4 convicted family members received the death sentence, but in 1972, California got rid of the death penalty. Charles Manson died from cardiac arrest in prison in 2017. There's so much more detail to fit into these minute videos. If you guys want to see me do a full version of this on my YouTube, let me know. After Charles Manson was released from prison in 1967, he moved to California. He learned to play guitar in jail and had dreams of becoming a famous musician. He met a woman named Mary Brunner and began living with her, and he used his persuasive ways to become a guru of sorts and gain followers called the Family. He taught his followers that they were the reincarnations of the original Christians. He often implied that he himself was Christ. They were also heavily influenced by LSD, alcohol, and music, the Beatles in particular. They traveled the West Coast in a hippie-renovated bus. In 1968, he and Mary Brunner had a child named Valentine Michael. They also established a home base this year at Spahn Ranch. Manson often preached about an upcoming race war. He became convinced that the Beatles song Helter Skelter was a call to action for this war. He declared to his followers that the lyrics from the White Album proved his predictions, and this message was meant for them. This would lead to an eruption of murder that we'll talk about in Part 3. Notorious True Crime, Day 8. John Wayne Gacy. Gacy was a serial killer and sex offender known as the Killer Clown. He assaulted and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy regularly performed at children's hospitals and charitable events as Pogo the Clown. He was married and divorced twice and had 2 children. He usually lured his victims in with the promise of construction work. He would assault, torture, and eventually strangle most of them with his hands or a rope. He then buried most of them under his house in the crawl space. The disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Pice finally led back to Gacy. Gacy was found guilty and sentenced to death. He took up art and began painting at his time in prison, leading up to his death by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Notorious True Crime, Day 1. Richard Ramirez. From April of 84 to August of 85, Richard Ramirez killed 14 people. He was also known as the Night Stalker and would break into people's homes mainly if the doors were unlocked. His murders were brutal, from sexual assault to even gouging out the eyes of some victims. He also forced some victims to pledge their love to Satan. He was a heavy drug user and dabbled in Satanism. After being caught, he was sentenced to death and responded, "Hey, big deal, death always comes with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland." While on death row, he married a supporter named Doreen Leoy. He remained on death row for almost 24 years, eventually dying of lymphoma in 2013. Notorious True Crime Day 5. David Berkowitz, aka Son of Sam. He claimed to have been told by a demonic dog to kill 6 people and wound 10 in shooting attacks that began in New York City during summer 1976. After one of the shooting sprees, he left a letter nearby addressed to the NYPD, calling himself Son of Sam for the first time. He continued leaving letters and taunting police, evading capture. At the scene of his last shootings, a witness saw a man flee in a car that had a parking ticket on it. Berkowitz was one of the few cars in the areas that had received parking tickets that day. He explained that he'd been commanded to kill by his neighbor Sam Carr, who sent messages through his dog, a demon-possessed Labrador retriever named Harvey. He received 25 to life for each murder. After hearing the judge's decision, he attempted to jump out the window of a 7th floor courtroom. He's currently 67 and imprisoned at Shawangunk Correctional Facility in Wallkill, New York. Notorious True Crime Day 7. Ed Gein. Ed was a notorious killer and grave robber. He inspired characters like Norman Bates, Buffalo Bill, and Leatherface. He grew up dominated by a controlling mother who he was completely devoted to, rarely leaving the house and never dating women. When his mother died in 1945, his mental health disintegrated. He left her room neat and untouched while the rest of the house fell apart. He killed 2 known victims and robbed numerous graves, cutting off body parts, practicing necrophilia, and making masks and suits out of skin. When police raided his home, they found one of his victims, Bernice Warden's headless, gutted body hanging from the ceiling. They also found organs in jars and skulls used as soup bowls. You can see some of his items here. He was initially found unfit to stand trial and eventually found insane and committed to Central State Hospital. He died of cancer and respiratory illness on July 26, 1984. Here's some facts about the movie Jennifer's Body. The creative team behind the film was mainly female, and they were really disappointed in the way the film was marketed. It was meant to speak to female empowerment and relationships between best friends. It ended up being marketed to a young male audience and used a poster like this. The movie was supposed to be much more of a traditional horror, but screenwriter Diablo Cody said the humor just kept sneaking in and it turned into a supernatural dark comedy horror. Also, Blake Lively almost played Jennifer. I don't know about you guys, but I can't imagine anybody besides Megan Fox in the role.
I am going to eat your soul and shit it out, Nikki! Oh, you only murder boys. I go both ways.
Jeffrey Dahmer murdered, dismembered, and consumed 17 boys and men from 1978 to 1991. He sought out his victims at gay bars, malls, and bus stops, lured them back to his place with promises of money or sex. He would usually give them alcohol laced with drugs and then strangle them. He would engage in necrophilia before dismembering and disposing of them. Well, some of them. He often kept their skulls as souvenirs, and he took photos of the victims in order to relive the experience. At one point, he even attempted a lobotomy by drilling into the victim's skull while they were still alive and pouring acid into it. Dahmer was captured in 1991, and a search of his house led to the discovery of a massive collection of bodies, including human heads in the fridge and freezer. He was sentenced to 16 life terms. In 1994, he was beaten to death by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver. Notorious True Crime Day 4. Albert Fish. Albert Fish was a serial killer and cannibal. He was also known as the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Boogeyman, and the Brooklyn Vampire. He had an abusive childhood, which led to the realization that he loved pain. He would hurt himself, most notably sticking pins in his abdomen, as seen in this X-ray. When it came to victims, Fish typically preyed on children with 3 confirmed kills. He eventually claimed to kill up to 100, but he was also known as a pathological liar. One of his most notable victims was 10-year-old Grace Budd, in which he sent a letter to her parents detailing how he murdered and consumed the girl. This letter also led to his capture. He was sentenced to death and died via electric chair on January 16, 1936. Notorious True Crime Day 2. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei was a Soviet serial killer, also known as the Butcher of Rostov. He sexually assaulted, murdered, and mutilated at least 52 women and children between 1978 and 1990. As a child, he was heavily bullied. As an adult, he was a school teacher and had a wife and 2 children. He was eventually banned from teaching due to claims of child abuse. His killing method was brutal. He befriended young runaways at train stations and bus stops and led them into forest areas. In a number of cases, he removed and ate body parts. He also had a pattern of damaging the eye area, either slashing or removing the eyeballs. Andre was able to escape suspicion for a long time because he was a non-secretor whose blood type cannot be inferred by anything other than a blood sample. He was finally arrested on November 20th, 1990, and he was executed by a shot in the back of the head on February 14th, 1994. Notorious True Crime, Day 6. Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader is also known as BTK, which stands for Bind, Torture, Kill. Between 1974 and 1991, he killed 10 people in Wichita and Park City, Kansas. He lived a double life with a wife, kids, and a secure job. The name BTK describes his kill method, and he would often wait in the houses of his victims for them to come home. He was a sexual sadist. He was also known for sending letters and packages taunting the police and even a potential victim who he waited for in their house, but they didn't come home in time. His killing subsided in 91, but the 30-year anniversary put it back in the headlines. And being as he's a narcissist, he couldn't help but reach out. He began again sending letters, packages, clues to police and media, including a computer disk that would lead to his downfall. He was arrested in February 2005 and later charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder. He pled guilty and gave horrifying details of his crimes in court. Observers noticed he showed no remorse or emotion. He's currently 75 and serving 10 life sentences. Notorious True Crime, Day 3. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway is also known as the Green River Killer. He was convicted of 49 murders but confessed to 71. He held a job painting trucks for 30 years and was married 3 times. He began murdering women in 1982 and was caught in 2001. His victims were young runaways and prostitutes who he found along State Route 99 in South King County, Washington. He would usually bring them to his home, strangle them, and then dump them in wooded areas, with the first few bodies found along the Green River. New DNA technology led to his capture in 2001. He was sentenced to life in prison in December 2003. An additional body linked to him was found in 2011, which landed him another life sentence. He is 71 years old and incarcerated at Washington State Penitentiary. Iconic Horror, Day 7. Psycho. Psycho was released in 1960 and directed by Alfred Hitchcock. It set a new level of violence and sexuality in American films. It's also considered by some to be one of the earliest examples of the slasher film. It involves a woman named Marion who's on the run, and she stops at the Bates Motel to get some rest. There she meets the strange Norman Bates, which we learn has many morbid secrets. And we can't forget the iconic shower scene. The filming angles, the soundtracks, the close-ups. We never really see any gore apart from some blood going down the drain. It's also said that Hitchcock shot the film in black and white because he felt the audience would not be able to handle the gore of the blood in color. And of course, let's not forget either the big reveal of Norman's mother. The character of Norman Bates was actually inspired by Ed Gein, who I'll also be talking about today. Iconic Horror, Day 8. It originally aired as a 2-part miniseries in 1990. It was based off the novel by Stephen King and directed by Tommy Lee Wallace. It takes place in 1960 and 7 preteen outcasts fight against an evil demon who poses as a child-killing clown. 30 years later, they reunite when it returns to their hometown. Tim Curry's portrayal of Pennywise is considered to be one of the scariest clown characters in film and TV history. Most of us also know of the remake that was made in 2017, and Chapter 2, which featured Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise. Bill seemed to live up to Tim Curry's legacy and received a lot of praise. Which portrayal did you find creepier? Iconic Horror, Day 6. Poltergeist. Poltergeist came out in 1982, directed by Tobe Hooper and created by Steven Spielberg. Stephen King was initially approached to write the script, but allegedly his publisher asked for too much money. It's a trilogy that revolves around the Freeling family who are terrorized by ghosts, mainly a demon they call the Beast. These spirits are particularly drawn to their youngest daughter, Carol Ann. And this is another film that's said to be cursed, which I already made a video about, but I'll repost it after this. There was a lot of death surrounding this film. Iconic Horror, Day 9. House of a Thousand Corpses. So I've talked about this one in my Sick and Twisted series. It came out in 2003 and is a dark comedy horror film. It's the first in a trilogy of films about the psychotic Firefly family. Some of my favorite characters are Baby Firefly, who's actually Rob Zombie, the director's wife, Otis B. Driftwood, Captain Spaulding, who's played by the late Sid Haig. The film actually did pretty bad among critics, but it gained a cult following. It's on Netflix, Hulu, and Prime, so you have no excuse not to watch it. Here's some facts about Carrie. Stephen King was only paid $2,500 for the rights to his book Carrie. It was his first film adaptation. His name was also misspelled in the trailer. In order to get into character, Sissy Spacek spent most of her time isolated from the rest of the cast. She wanted to embrace the alienation that Carrie faces. De Palma, the director, wanted a stunt person for the final scene, but Spacek insisted on doing it herself and requiring her to be buried under the ground. Carrie's school, Bates High School, is a nod to Hitchcock's Psycho. Stephen King wanted Lindsay Lohan to play Carrie in the 2011 remake. What's your favorite Stephen King film adaptation? Iconic Horror, Day 4. Child's Play. Child's Play was originally released in 1988 and directed by Tom Holland. In this one, dying murderer Charles Lee Ray uses black magic to put a soul inside a doll named Chucky. Karen Barclay buys the Good Guys doll for her son Andy, and they soon realize that the doll is actually alive and a killer. The franchise has 8 films and branches out to play with dark humor and even becoming a little satirical and campy. I personally love when Tiffany, Chucky's bride, is introduced. There was also a reboot in 2019, which I've yet to watch because I hate the way they made Chucky look. If you guys saw that new one, what did you think? Iconic Horror, Day 3. A Nightmare on Elm Street. A Nightmare on Elm Street was originally released in 1984 and directed by Wes Craven. There are 9 films in the franchise. If you don't know, this one is about teenagers living on Elm Street in Ohio. This group has their dreams invaded by a burnt killer with a glove made of blades. And by killing them in their dreams, he also kills them in real life. This killer is none other than Freddy Krueger, who was a child murderer who was burned alive by parents living on the street. One of the inspirations for the film actually came from articles that Craven read about a group of teenage immigrants who died in their sleep after suffering disturbing nightmares. I guess Freddy was the OG sleep paralysis demon. Iconic Horror, Day 5. The Exorcist. The Exorcist came out in 1973 and was directed by William Friedkin. It was one of the most profitable horror films of all time. It was also the first horror film to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture. It centers around a girl named Regan who's possessed by a demon. It was said to be cursed, and I've done a video about why, so I'll repost it now. It had a strong reaction from audiences, even claims of nausea and fainting. In August of 2020, it was announced that a reboot of the film is in the works for Morgan Creek Entertainment and slated for release in 2021. What do you guys think? Will the reboot ever be able to do it justice?